The jungle was boiling that morning, air so thick it clung to every breath. Cicadas screamed over the sound of boots stomping wet dirt. A group of Japanese nurses, uniforms torn and dirty with sweat, stumbled out of the green fog. They had run out of pain medicine 2 days ago, food the day before that. When they saw the American patrol, guns raised, they stopped as if the earth itself had grabbed them. One sharp command cut through the sticky air. "Take off your clothes. Bend down." The translator froze, unsure. The women stood still, eyes wide, fingers shaking, mud streaked across their faces. It wasn't just fear. It was the shame they had been told to expect if caught. In their minds, giving up meant disgrace worse than death. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The only sound was the click of a gun being pulled back. The sergeant's voice got harder. He said the order again, slower this time, colder. The translator finally stuttered the words, his voice shaking. None of the women understood why they were being made to undress or why the Americans kept looking at their bodies for hidden knives. In Japanese training books, capture meant torture. In reality, this was a search rule, normal and businesslike, but that difference was lost between languages and sweat. One nurse whispered to another, "They will kill us now." Instead, a medic stepped forward with gloves and checked their sleeves, belts and shoes for razors or bombs. Standard steps after reports of suicide attacks disguised as giving up. Reports show over 3,500 Japanese female helpers were caught across Southeast Asia by 1945, many armed with hidden poison pills. The Americans weren't cruel, they were scared. From the prisoner's view, this was unthinkable. Being ordered to undress by the enemy wasn't just exposure. It was the breaking of an entire code. Yet in that frozen moment, something changed. The soldiers didn't laugh or hit. They just looked, nodded, and moved aside. The women realized this wasn't shame before death. It was confusion, care, procedure. One of them later wrote in her diary, "We thought this was shame before death, but no one died that day." The only thing that broke was certainty, the certainty of what they'd been told about their enemies. And as the Americans' boots crunched closer through the mud, a new kind of fear took shape, not of dying, but of being misunderstood. Rain began to fall in thin silver threads, turning the clearing into a patch of slow, moving mud. The same American sergeant stepped forward, water dripping from his helmet rim. He said the command again, this time more slowly, his voice carrying anger rather than threat. The translator, a nervous Filipino soldier, hesitated again. His Japanese words were patchy. Enough for orders, not enough for details. The words he chose turned checking into stripping. That single wrong translation froze the moment in history. The women, terrified, believed the rumors they'd heard since Manila, stories that caught nurses were hurt before death. One clutched a small sewing needle hidden in her sleeve, ready to stab her own throat if needed. The sergeant noticed her movement and shouted another word, but the rain drowned his meaning. For a heartbeat, the two sides stared across the mud, each thinking the other was seconds from violence. Then an older medic stepped forward, hands raised, speaking softly. He acted out a search, tapping his own sleeves, showing his empty palms. Slowly, the message landed. The Japanese women began to obey, stiffly removing belts and bandages. Their eyes looked toward the translator for clues that never came. Later, field reports showed that over 80% of Allied translators in the Pacific weren't fully fluent, often self-taught during short training bursts. 62 combat operations were logged with serious translation errors that nearly started firefights. This was one of them. The Americans weren't brutes. They were scared. Suicide bombs disguised in medicine pouches had killed several medics weeks earlier. Every movement felt like a trap. One prisoner whispered, "They weren't monsters, just terrified of our hidden blades." When the checking ended, the women were handed rough army blankets and told to sit. The GI stepped back, unsure how to act around prisoners who looked more like tired students than soldiers. The sergeant removed his helmet, wiped his face, and muttered something under his breath. The translator didn't translate it, but one word stood out. Protocol. For the first time, the tension broke not with laughter, but with an awkward silence heavy enough to fill the jungle. The nurses, still shivering, realized that death had passed them by, but in its place another feeling crept in: curiosity, because what came next wasn't cruelty at all. It was care. Night fell like a curtain over the jungle. The rain eased into mist, and the only light came from flickering lamps around the American camp edge. The Japanese women sat under a makeshift tarp, shivering, arms wrapped in rough blankets. Every creak of boots, every click of metal made them flinch. They expected mockery, punishment, maybe worse, but instead, someone came near holding something that glowed faintly gold in the firelight. "A tin can, Peaches," the soldier said, kneeling. He slid it across the mud, then stepped back. The women didn't move. One finally opened it with shaking fingers, the sweet smell rising like something unreal, canned fruit in a war zone. She hadn't tasted sugar in months. That night the captives watched Americans eat from identical meals, no special treatment, no laughter at their expense, just quiet chewing and the occasional cough. Then, amazingly, one GI handed them spoons. It was the smallest act, yet it broke years of propaganda in an instant. According to supply records, U.S. field meals averaged 4,200 calories per day, nearly double what Japanese troops received. Protein, sugar, even chocolate bars were standard issue. For the women who'd survived on rice and salt water, this was industrial plenty beyond imagination. One nurse wrote later, "Even their prisoners ate better than our soldiers." As the hours passed, they realized something even stranger. No guard hit them. No one yelled. Instead, a medic came by with iodine and bandages. He motioned for their hands. Hesitant, one woman offered hers bloodied, blistered. The medic dabbed antiseptic and said nothing. The sting burned, but the gesture disarmed her more than any weapon could. Across the camp, another soldier joked quietly with his partner, and for the first time since capture, the women heard something they hadn't expected from the enemy. Laughter that wasn't cruel. It was ordinary human. Later, as they lay under damp blankets, they listened to the faint hum of engines somewhere in the dark. Truck generators, machines of endless supply. For them, supplies had been starvation. For the Americans, it was routine. And in that contrast, something fundamental cracked. The enemy wasn't barbaric. They were organized, fed, and frighteningly efficient. The firelight flickered against the nurses' faces, reflecting both fear and wonder. Outside, boots crunched toward the tents again, this time not with rifles, but with more bandages and a single metal kettle steaming in the night. By dawn, the rain had stopped, but the jungle smelled of rotten medicine. The Americans had moved fast canvas stretched over bamboo poles, forming what looked like a small hospital. A hand-painted sign read "Quarantine." Inside, the air buzzed with disinfectant and the hiss of boiling water. The Japanese women were ordered in, not as prisoners this time, but as patients. The transformation was almost surreal. Where they expected cages, they found cots. Where they feared ropes, they saw soap. The US medics worked in silence, sleeves rolled, eyes focused. They weren't gentle exactly, but they were methodical. A soldier pointed at a metal basin, hands wash. The translator's voice trembled through the translation, but the meaning was clear enough. One by one, the women scrubbed. The water turned grey, then brown, then black. It wasn't just dirt coming off. It was months of war. An American nurse entered next, her uniform stiff, her expression professional. She started examining the prisoners' wounds, marking their charts. Malaria, dysentery, dehydration. Her accent clipped the words into rhythm. Reports from that period confirm that U.S. field hospitals in the Pacific processed over 12,000 patients every month by mid-1945. Disease was deadlier than bullets, and the medics treated even the enemy because infection didn't care about flags. One Japanese nurse, fevered and weak, whispered something the translator barely caught. "Why help us?" The medic shrugged. "Rules are rules." The irony stung deeper than iodine. The same code that ordered their capture now demanded their care. When the women emerged from the tent, they looked less like prisoners, more like ghosts, freshly cleaned for a new afterlife. The American camp smelled faintly of coffee and diesel. The jungle beyond smelled like everything they'd left behind: sweat, gunpowder, fear. They noticed something else too: the soldiers' uniforms, patched and dusty, but intact. Their boots didn't rot, their supplies didn't vanish. This was an empire of supplies, not slogans, and in the middle of it, the women realized that power wasn't always cruelty. It could also be skill. As the sun climbed higher, one of the nurses caught the distant sound of laughter from outside, a strange musical sound they'd never heard from the enemy. She leaned toward the tent flap to listen. not realizing that the next sound, the crack of a notebook closing, would mark the next turning point in their captivity. The laughter outside faded into the rustle of papers. Sergeant Robert Lane sat beneath a dim lantern, his back against a supply crate, rain tapping the canvas above. His gloves lay beside him, mud-streaked, torn at the fingertips, in his lap a small notebook. Each page already spotted with sweat and ink. He wrote like a man trying to reason with himself. They looked more like students than soldiers. One entry began, eyes sunken, hands raw. They couldn't have been older than 20. The Americans around him smoked, joked, played cards. Lane didn't join. His duty had been to secure the prisoners, but what lingered with him wasn't the operation. It was the faces. He'd seen men die, but never enemies so fragile. Somewhere deep inside, a line he didn't know existed had started to blur. Field records later confirmed that nearly 40% of US frontline soldiers kept journals during World War II, though most were taken away or censored after the war. Lane's wasn't. It survived tucked inside his footlocker, smudged but readable. His words showed a soldier wrestling with obedience and empathy in the same breath. He described the camp's silence after lights out, the women whispering in Japanese, the guards pretending not to hear, the smell of medicine still clinging to their hands. Orders are orders. He wrote again, but the sentence trailed off mid-line as if he'd stopped believing it halfway through. At one point he recorded an exchange. "Why are they so quiet?" someone asked. "Maybe they think we're going to kill them tomorrow," Lane replied. "Are we? No, not unless someone tells us to." That was the war in a sentence. Nobody knew the rules anymore, only that they had to keep pretending they did. Near the end of his entry that night, Lane closed with a line that felt like confession. "We were told to treat them with respect, but no one told us how." He shut the notebook, slid it into his pack, and stared toward the medical tent where the women now slept. In the faint glow of dawn, the first evacuation orders came through. Movement at sunrise. He didn't know it yet, but that march would become the longest day of their captivity. The whistle blew at dawn, sharp metallic final. Jungle mist clung low as the line of prisoners began to move. Japanese nurses, still weak from fever, carried what little they had: canteens, blankets, scraps of dignity. American guards flanked them on both sides, rifles angled down but ready. No one spoke. The war had already ended in principle. But out here in the sweltering edges of the Pacific, peace hadn't caught up yet. The march to the coast was supposed to take 6 hours. It took 8. The heat was merciless, temperatures above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The path a broken thread of mud and coral rock. One woman collapsed before noon. A medic lifted her onto a truck meant for supplies. Lane walked beside them, counting steps instead of miles. Local villagers watched from a distance, eyes wide, whispering. To them, the scene must have looked upside down. Americans escorting Japanese captives instead of the other way around. Some spat on the ground, others offered silence. Lane noticed how his own men tensed when passing civilians, fingers brushing triggers. One soldier muttered, "Keep them moving, no stops." Another added, "Command says evac by sundown." But it wasn't hostility driving the pace. It was fear of ambush. Reports from the sector showed guerrilla attacks still occurring weekly, leftover forces refusing surrender. Every rustle in the jungle felt like the start of a firefight. From the prisoners' view, it was something else entirely. They saw Americans shielding them, literally stepping between them and the villagers' glare. "They protected us," one nurse later wrote from their own. By mid-afternoon, the salt tang of the ocean drifted through the trees. The sound of seagulls felt unreal after weeks of gunfire. The women, blistered and drenched in sweat, began to realize this wasn't a march toward punishment, it was transit, destination unknown. Lane called a brief halt near the ridge overlooking the bay. Below, ships bobbed in the sunlight, grey silhouettes waiting like ghosts. The coastline shimmered, metallic and still. He looked back at the column of exhausted prisoners and muttered to no one, 18 miles. They made it. The sea breeze rolled in, carrying both relief and the faint smell of diesel. It felt like freedom's edge, but not theirs yet, because beyond that blue horizon waited a camp and a routine none of them could have imagined. By evening, the prisoners reached the coast, a patch of scrubland carved into neat rows of tents. The air smelled of salt, tar, and disinfectant. American sentries stood on wooden watchtowers, silhouetted against the sinking sun. A whistle cut through the noise, and the women were lined up, counted, and handed numbered tags. No names, just digits stamped in metal. This was Camp Redleaf, one of 27 US-run POW sites across the Pacific by late 1945. It wasn't luxury, but it was order. The nurses, still disoriented, were shown their quarters. 6 to a tent, 1 oil lamp, 1 bucket, and strict rules. At dawn, a whistle. At night, silence. The routine was military precision turned inside out. Every morning, the same pattern unfolded. Whistle, roll call, ration line, medical inspection, then rest. For women trained to obey Japan's strict codes of loyalty and silence, captivity became its own strange discipline. They scrubbed their own cots, folded their own blankets, learned the rhythm of their guards' footsteps, and slowly something began to shift. The fear dulled into routine, routine into survival. Lane watched from the perimeter, notebook again in hand. He noticed details the others missed, the way they bowed slightly before eating, how they murmured thanks in Japanese even when no one understood. One morning he saw a young nurse trying to read an English sign outside the mess tent. Keep area clean. She traced each letter with her finger, whispering the sounds. When he asked what she was doing, she looked up and said softly, "Learning your words." That moment, tiny and awkward, stuck with him more than any battle he'd fought. The Americans, too, seemed to relax. They stopped staring like guards and started acting like colleagues, forced to share the same sunburn and boredom. They traded cigarettes for sketches, soap for sewing repairs. The women even began stitching torn US uniforms, a reversal that unsettled everyone at first, then became normal. Still, every sound of engines outside the wire reminded them this was not freedom. One nurse later wrote, "We became numbers, but clean ones." As night fell, the generators coughed to life, bathing the camp in faint yellow light, and beneath that hum, one voice broke the silence, reading quietly from a letter she'd never be allowed to send. Late nights in the barracks carried a sound different from the jungle paper, the slow, careful rustle of pencils scratching across salvaged scraps. The Japanese women wrote when the camp went quiet after the guards' rounds, when the only light came from the flicker of kerosene lamps. They wrote to families they weren't sure were alive, to fathers who'd never forgive surrender, to children too young to remember their faces. They didn't have envelopes, just folded sheets tucked under blankets. Some drew small flowers in the margins, others apologized for still breathing. The act of writing was rebellion in its softest form. Lane noticed one night while patrolling a woman crouched by the lamplight, lips moving silently as she wrote. He didn't stop her. He just nodded and walked past. Later, he'd learned those letters would never leave the camp. Under Red Cross agreements, all POW mail passed through Allied censors first, and by August 1945, over 60,000 POW letters were collected and withheld, many locked in storage until 1952. Anything emotional, political, or defeatist was marked undeliverable. The women wrote anyway, as if words could cross oceans without permission. One letter found decades later reads simply, "I am alive but smaller." That was enough. Every morning, censors came through the camp officers with red pencils, scanning for forbidden phrases. Regret, shame, suicide. Whole paragraphs vanished underneath diagonal lines. The women never knew. They only saw their pages returned blank with a small note held for review. To them, it felt like being silenced twice, once by capture and again by mercy. Lane began keeping some of the discarded letters, slipping them between pages of his journal, not out of pity, out of curiosity. He wanted to understand what silence sounded like on paper. By September, the prisoners no longer asked when they'd be released. They just wrote. The words became anchors, a ritual. When you can't speak to the world, you build one instead. At sunrise one morning, a corporal entered with a new order in his hand, his boots leaving dark prints across the sand floor. The letters stopped mid-sentence as everyone looked up. Whatever came next, it wasn't going to fit in an envelope. The day started like any other whistle, roll call, ration line. But by mid-morning, the air changed. The guards gathered near the radio shack, their faces unreadable. A faint static bled through the camp loudspeakers, followed by a voice none of the prisoners recognized. It was soft, formal, and trembling. The interpreter listened first, eyes widening. Then he whispered the impossible, "It's the Emperor." The women froze. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese Emperor's broadcast traveled by shortwave to every Allied post across the Pacific. It was the first time his people had ever heard his voice, and the words, distorted by static and distance, were surrender. No cheers came from the prisoners, no crying either, just stillness. One woman pressed her hands to her ears as if refusing to believe it. Another stared at the ground, lips moving soundlessly. For them, surrender wasn't salvation. It was erasure. Everything they'd endured, every order they'd obeyed, dissolved in a few trembling sentences from a man they'd been taught was divine. Outside the barbed wire, the Americans didn't celebrate either. They just listened. One radio operator removed his headphones and whispered, "It's over." But the word hung heavy, like it didn't quite know what to do with itself. According to Allied records, the Emperor's message reached Pacific outposts within 6 hours of the original broadcast in Tokyo. For the prisoners, it was the first proof that their homeland still existed and that it had stopped fighting. Lane wrote in his diary that day, "They didn't cheer. They just stared at the dirt." Afterward, a young nurse asked him quietly, "Does this mean we can go home?" Lane hesitated. He didn't know how to say that peace on paper didn't mean freedom in practice. There were still ships to come, papers to sign, screenings to pass. War might be over for governments, but for prisoners, the waiting had just begun. That night, the camp lights stayed on longer than usual. The radio kept humming, replaying news from Tokyo-bombed cities, burned ports, the phrase "unconditional surrender." Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japan was silent. But inside the wire, silence was the only sound that made sense. And as the broadcast faded into static, the next order arrived, one that would finally send them toward home. The camp gates opened not with fanfare, but with bureaucracy. The war was technically over, yet the machinery of record-keeping rolled on. Trucks arrived bearing Red Cross insignia, white circles on fading paint. Dust streaked across the sides. From them stepped doctors, clerks, and photographers. Their mission was simple: count, record, and return. The Japanese women were lined up outside the barracks under the morning sun. Clipboards clicked, cameras flashed. For the first time since capture, their names were written down in full. A nurse looked at her own tag, just a number till yesterday, and whispered her real name aloud, as if testing whether it still belonged to her. Each woman passed through a row of tables, one station for fingerprints, one for medical screening, one for photographs, 3 angles, no smiles. Red Cross documentation lists show 3,321 Japanese women processed for exchange in 1945 to 46, most from the Philippines and New Guinea. The medics weighed them next body by body, statistic by statistic. One officer muttered 92 pounds. She's heavier than the last one. The data meant survival. The tone meant detachment. Lane stood nearby, assigned to escort duty. He tried not to watch, but couldn't help noticing the strange blend of ritual and relief. Every motion was mechanical, yet beneath it ran something unspoken gratitude mixed with disbelief. When the nurse from the jungle line reached the medical table, she asked in halting English, "You send us home?" The Red Cross official looked up, half smiling. If the sea behaves, that answer lingered like prophecy. Behind the rows of processing tents, crates were stacked with blankets, soap, tins of rations, enough to last the voyage. Each woman received one set. Inside, she found a mirror wrapped in cloth. Most hadn't seen their reflections in months. The first glances were painful, faces thinner, older, but alive. The final stop was paperwork, declarations confirming they'd been treated according to the Geneva Convention. The irony wasn't lost on them. When it was over, they were herded toward the beach. Ships started the horizon, grey, low and waiting. Engines thudded softly over the surf. Lane watched them board the trucks that would carry them to the docks. He wrote one last line in his notebook. We had to prove they were alive before we could let them go. And out at sea, smoke from the waiting ships smeared the sky like a promise half kept. The dock groaned beneath the weight of boots and crates. Salt wind whipped through the lines of prisoners as they climbed the gangway onto a grey transport ship. The sea was restless, streaked with foam, the horizon so bright it blurred the eyes. The American guards didn't bark orders anymore. They just pointed and helped them board one by one. For the first time in months, the women felt the solid vibration of engines beneath their feet. Diesel fumes mixed with ocean spray, forming a haze that clung to their skin. The ship's horn blared, a low, mournful note that rolled across the bay and into the jungle behind them. Camp Redleaf vanished into distance, its tents shrinking to dots. Inside the ship, bunks lined the steel walls. No chains, no cages, just narrow spaces, shared rations, and an unspoken truce. Lane was assigned to supervise one of the lower decks. When he passed through, a few of the nurses bowed slightly. He didn't know whether it was respect or habit. Maybe both. They sailed east. The voyage from Manila to Yokohama spanned roughly 1,800 miles, taking 12 days if weather held. The Pacific stretched endless and indifferent, each wave erasing another piece of war. At night, the women stood at the railing, watching phosphorescent light shimmer in the water. No borders, no noise, just the rhythm of the sea, reminding them how small survival really was. The guards too softened. They shared cigarettes, coffee, even jokes. One soldier traded a chocolate bar for a hand-sewn patch. Another offered his canteen to a feverish prisoner without thinking. For a moment, enemy and ally blurred into something simpler, just people waiting for home. Lane wrote, "The ocean didn't care who had won. Still, every sunrise felt heavier. The women would wake to seagulls circling above, wondering what waited on the other side. Japan had surrendered, but no one knew what surrender would look like once they stepped ashore." Some whispered about burned cities, others about families gone. By the 15th day, the air grew colder, the waves rougher. Storm warnings came through the radio. Typhoon season approaching fast. The captain ordered hatches secured and lifeboats checked. The women gathered below deck, listening to the wind begin its long rising howl, and somewhere above them, lightning flashed like a camera capturing history mid-breath. The sky collapsed into grey. By midnight, the Pacific turned violent waves hammering the hull, rain slicing sideways across the deck. The ship lurched, metal groaning under the strain. Inside, the lights flickered, then dimmed to emergency glow. Buckets slid across the floor as the crew shouted orders through the wind. The Japanese women clung to bunks and railings, eyes wide, breaths sharp and quick. No one slept. Every crack of thunder sounded like artillery coming back from the past. The sea heaved, tossing memory and fear together until neither made sense. Lane fought his way down to the lower deck, water pooled at his boots. He found one of the nurses crouched under a beam, arms wrapped around her knees, whispering in Japanese, a prayer maybe, or just a rhythm to survive the noise. He steadied her shoulder. She looked up, eyes wild with panic. "We die?" she asked, voice nearly lost under the roar. Lane shook his head. Not tonight. He didn't know if it was true, but saying it mattered. For hours the storm tore at them. The ship tilted hard to port, then righted itself, engines coughing through the swells. A lifeboat broke loose, crashing into the waves below. In the chaos, hierarchy vanished. Americans and Japanese alike grabbed ropes, steadied beams, bailed water. Survival reduced everyone to the same rank. Historical reports confirm that the 1945 typhoon season sank 19 Allied ships, killing hundreds even after the war officially ended. Nature hadn't signed the surrender. The nurse clutched Lane's sleeve, whispering something he couldn't hear. When the lightning flared again, he saw her face clearly, soaked, pale, trembling, and realized she was no longer afraid of him. Just of the sea, he said nothing. She would later recall, he just held my hand. By dawn, the storm began to break. The clouds thinned, the waves softened into long, rolling swells. Exhaustion replaced terror. The prisoners emerged onto the deck, blinking at the washed-out horizon. And then someone pointed. Faint through the mist, A dark line rose from the water. Land. They stood shoulder to shoulder, hair plastered, uniforms torn, salt crusted on their skin. The ship's horn sounded once low, steady, triumphant in its own quiet way. Japan was out there waiting, but what waited on land would not be the home they remembered. When the ship finally anchored at Yokohama, the air carried no celebration, just the smell of ash and rust. Japan wasn't the homeland they'd left. It was a graveyard built from concrete and silence. Smoke still drifted from ruins on the horizon. Streets once crowded with flags now held only bicycles, rubble, and stray dogs. The Japanese women stepped off the transport one by one, wrapped in US Army blankets, identification tags still hanging from their necks. Locals along the dock stared as if ghosts had walked ashore. No cheers, no embraces, just whispers that cut deeper than the sea ever could. Captured women, someone muttered. Shameful. They'd survived everything the jungle disease storms and now faced the sharp edge of their own society. Reports from Japan's post-war Ministry of Health show that nearly 70% of returning POWs, male and female, faced discrimination or job loss upon return. For women, it was worse. Surrender equaled dishonor. Many families refused to take them back. One nurse tried to hand her repatriation papers to a local officer. He wouldn't touch them. "You were in enemy care," he said flatly. "You're not registered yet." Lane watched from the pier, hands buried in his pockets. His unit had been ordered to supervise disembarkation before returning to Manila. He saw the same women who had marched barefoot through jungle now walk across their homeland like trespassers, their shoulders straight but eyes hollow. He thought of his journal entries, how he'd written about their silence, their endurance. Now that silence filled the port itself, no one spoke, no one waved. The war had ended, but mercy hadn't followed it home. One of the women reached into her satchel and found a small cloth bundle. Inside lay a folded letter, the one she'd written months earlier, never sent. She stared at it for a long time, then tucked it back away. Some messages weren't meant to travel. Lane closed his notebook one final time. The Red Cross officer nearby called out the last roll number. The ship's horn sounded behind him, signaling departure. He didn't look back until the dock was empty. Just wet boards, fading footprints, and a single tin can left sitting near the gangway. Inside that can waited the smallest piece of the war, still unspoiled, and one of them was about to open it again. Years passed. The war became memory. The ruins turned into glass and concrete, and the world moved on, except for her. The nurse from that jungle clearing lived quietly in a rebuilt Tokyo apartment, her hair streaked with grey, her name still half whispered in her neighborhood. On a wooden shelf near the window, she kept one strange relic of the past, a dented US Army can of peaches. The label had long faded metal dulled by decades of air and time, but she never opened it. Visitors sometimes asked why she kept a piece of the enemy's ration in her home. She always gave the same answer because it was the first thing that wasn't hate. That night in the jungle, the can sliding across the mud, the sweetness she could barely taste, had outlasted every uniform, every flag. It wasn't about the fruit. It was about the shock of kindness from a hand she'd been taught to fear. Official post-war records list millions of Americans' sea rations issued through 1945, each one containing a 4-ounce tin of peaches, standard dessert for soldiers and prisoners alike. Most were eaten and forgotten, but this one became a monument to contradiction. Sometimes when Tokyo trembled with rain, she'd polish the can gently with a handkerchief, eyes lost somewhere between memory and disbelief. That night, under a tarp of ration boxes, she had learned something that no radio or surrender speech could teach, that war wasn't just fought with weapons, it was survived with gestures. She'd seen the worst of humanity and still found a reason to remember the smallest act of decency, not because it erased the pain, but because it proved something inside people refused to die. Her diary entry from 1946 reads simply, "Kindness was the only thing we weren't trained for." Outside her window, Tokyo lights shimmered across the rebuilt skyline, neon reflections where firestorms once burned. She didn't call herself a survivor, and she never spoke of Lane or the camp again. But the can remained silent and whole. When she died in 1972, it was found on that same shelf, still sealed. Archivists later placed it in a museum labelled Only Personal Item, 1945. And under the glass, that small dented can glows softly, even now proof that mercy once given doesn't rot.